recent work that I've conducted in my team, where we try to reconsider classical views about the sources of decision variability, and we got to surprising consequences regarding the nature and the origin of what people call exploration in reward-guided learning. So I'm going to walk you through it. So I'm going to start by showing you the overall perspective in which my research is grounded, which is the notion of uncertainty in decision making. And uncertainty is seen by many of us here as a core problem for learning and decision making, whether you are just a hunter-gatherer looking at footprints in the sand and deciding whether they belong to a prey maybe or a predator, whether you're a stock trader in the city trying to decide whether you should buy or sell volatile stocks, or whether you're a voter trying to decide whether you should remain or leave the EU. And in all these situations, variability is seen as a characteristic of these decisions made under uncertainty, and this variability can have very dire consequences for the decision maker. It can be physical injury if you mistake a small prey or a large predator, a large animal for a small prey, or it can lead to bankruptcy if you buy crappy stocks, or it can lead to Brexit. So while these examples are clearly very, very different, I will try to argue today that they share a common cognitive process, which I will refer to as probabilistic inference, which lies in the combination of multiple ambiguous cues providing imperfect information about the state of the environment. And I'm going to start by briefly introducing the way we thought about this issue by showing you how we used that framework of probabilistic inference to try to dissect the sources of decision variability under uncertainty. And so I'm going to show you how in the lab we try to put subjects in situations where they have to make decisions under uncertainty, and how we could dissociate where this variability that we observed in their behavior comes from. So the task is very simple. So the task consists in a series of visual stimuli. I don't have a pointer, but I won't need it because the slides are very well animated. So people are seeing a series of samples like this. So sample one, you see the only thing that you should look at is the orientation of the pattern that you can see. And subjects see a series of them on each chart, and they know that they can have been generated by two possible distributions that I show you on the right. So you see, so that's probability distributions over angles. So you see that the blue distribution is peaking around the right diagonal, and the blue one, and the pink one above around the left diagonal. So people are seeing this series of samples, and at the end of the sequence, they have to guess whether the sequence is of type A or type B. So they have to guess what was the generative distribution of the sequence. So as you can see, because the two distributions are very much overlapping, each sample in isolation only provides a small amount of information regarding the generative category of the sequence, right? So subjects are, in these situations, forced to accumulate evidence over the different samples to try to improve their decision accuracy. And so the other good thing about this task is that it's very easy to define the normative behavior. So what an optimal, if you want to say Bayesian decision maker would do in that context, which simply is to sum the log likelihood ratio so the ratio of the probabilities that the card is generated given each category. So you just sum these informations provided by each card, and you just take the sign of the accumulated evidence, which is just the sum of these log likelihood ratios. So it's very easy. So then we can directly compare the behavior of our subjects, which we test in the lab, to the behavior of an optimal decision maker, which would have played the exact same task and trials. So we can check how much subjects depart from this base optimal strategy and behavior. So here I'm plotting you on the x-axis the number of samples that I give to my subject before asking them for a decision. It can go from only 2 stimuli up to 16. Okay, and on the y-axis, I'm plotting you the accuracy of the decisions made by the subjects, which are the dots on this graph, and the base optimal observer, which is the dotted line, right? So as you can see, subjects like the Bayesian observer are clearly accumulating information over cards, because you can see that their performance is gradually increasing with the number of samples that they have at their disposal to decide, right? Something else that you can see is that subjects feature a substantial amount of suboptimal decision errors, meaning the difference between the dotted line and the human data, so the dots, the big dots. So the question is, where does this variability come from? And if you look at different subfields of decision research, different theories have emphasized different sources of variability. If you think of perceptual decisions, of the kind of Janneke has presented this morning, people usually assume that most of the variability that we find in subjects' behavior comes from noisy processing of the sensory features. So in this task, because the only relevant feature is the orientation of the cues, you would assume that subjects are not seeing each of the orientations perfectly, but with some noise, and that this noise is then what produces the variability and the errors that we see in the behavior. Another possibility, which is more rarely considered directly by models, is a possibility that subjects would feature errors in these probabilistic reasoning tasks because they have trouble combining ambiguous pieces of information. So every time they have to combine a new information provided by the sample that they are looking at right now with what they had accumulated so far, that could result in some variability or errors in this accumulation process, and that could lead to errors. And then if you're an economist thinking about decision-making, economists have thought about decision rules that are not optimal, which are often called softmax decision rules. So they are the kind of sigmoids that I show there, which is a generalization of what you might have heard of as probability matching behavior. That when you're facing a 60-40 choice, so A is 60% likely to be correct given what you've seen, and B only 40, that you would not always pick A, which would be rational and optimal, but you would sometimes explore B just in case, or something like that, okay? So this one in the middle is, to our knowledge, at least Jan Drugovich and my knowledge when we started that project, was often assumed to be negligible in theory, okay? The good thing is that in this simple task, the three have dissociable statistical properties. So we can define different models for each of the sources and see which one of them is accounting for most of the errors that we see in subject behavior. And I'm not going to walk you through this particular study because I'm going to move to reward-guided learning afterwards, but just so that you have an idea of what we found in this study, because it's going to be relevant for the rest. We found that almost 90% of the variability that we observed overall in their behavior, by variability I mean departures from the normative Bayesian behavior, were due to errors in the inference process. So not sensory errors, not the fact that you see the samples, the orientations not very well, or not because you're deciding with this kind of softmax probability matching strategy, but because subjects are bad, or not bad, but have trouble combining optimally different samples of ambiguous information. On the right side, I'm just showing you that our model fitting procedure that led to the left part is not biased. So we simulated models with different sources of variability in them, so we know what we're simulating, and we're just testing whether we can recover the right source that we put in the models when we make the model play the task and look at its behavior. So the fact that this matrix shows a large number on the diagonals means that we can recover the source that we put in the model. So we can be relatively confident that if we see the left side in the human data, we are not completely misassigning variability, okay? Something else that we did in this task, because something that could happen, and that Brad has talked about this yesterday morning, is that, of course, subjects are not necessarily bias optimal. They might feature a large number of various heuristics in the way that they combine these cards. Maybe they just don't really look at the information provided by the cards and sum them, but they just count the number of cards that look a bit more pink or more blue, and they just do a sum, okay? That would be a very simple approximation of the sort that Brad has talked to us about yesterday. So the way that we tried to tackle this problem is that we couldn't, of course, think of all the possible biases, the weird things that each of the subjects was trying to do in this task. So we used a different approach to try to decompose the overall amount of noise in the inference process into what we call a bias term, which is all the heuristics that you could think about. The only important thing is that they're deterministic. If subjects are facing twice the same trial exactly, they would do the same heuristic. So that's the way they're defined in this bias variance framework. And the variance part on the right is what is completely stochastic, something that is unpredictable from one trial to the next. Okay? And the way we could split this inference noise into these two parts was by comparing the consistency of the decisions made by the same subjects on two exact repetitions of the same trial. Okay? So if the subject is suboptimal but perfectly consistent with himself or herself, it would mean that all of the variability that we observed is due to biases. Maybe biases that I don't know how to model, because there are plenty of them. Even in a simple task like this, I can at least think of 10 or 15 of them. And we tried that. And the other part, imagine that subjects are not more consistent, not very consistent across repetitions of the exact same sequence, and not more consistent than an observer with only stochastic noise, would mean that there are no biases, and what we observe in their variability is due to variance or random errors in the way they combine the cards. So as you could see, what we observed in the human behavior was something relatively surprising, which is that most of the variability we see is not due to heuristics in this particular task, but seems to be due to the limited precision of the way people combine these ambiguous pieces of information. Okay? And the exercise is interesting because it doesn't depend on the experimenter or the researcher to think of all the possible biases that subjects might feature. Because even in a simple task, it's a doomed exercise. It's not going to work. It's an infinite thing. So you will not ever be able to put a line there and say, this is what's predictable, this is what's unpredictable. So at least that's, yes, you can't hear me. Okay, I'll stay there, yeah. Okay, so the important thing there was that we could say, okay, so most of it doesn't seem to come from biases, but from true noise variance in the way people combine information. So now one question. So we obtained that finding in this very peculiar task where people see these Gabor patterns that have nothing natural in them. And we wanted to see how much the findings that we got there were extrapolatable or were generalizable to other cognitive domains, other types of decisions. So if you remember two of my earlier examples, I started with this footprints in the sand example. So in the lab, typically, the tasks look a bit like my original task. So people look at these noisy stimuli. In my case, they were combining multiple stimuli. Here it's just one. And you're trying to guess whether this noisy pattern looks more like A or B. And then if you think of this economic stock trader kind of decision, buying or selling stocks, then in the lab, people use very simple restless bandits, so simple slot machines, so where people are faced with two levers, they can pull one or the other. They observe an outcome, which is a reward or no reward or a punishment, like what Stefano has shown you yesterday. And people learn in this task by trying to guess by trial and error which of the two levers seems to give out more rewards than the other, right? And so these two types of decisions are quite different, okay? They don't use the same sensory input, the same input. So for perceptual decisions, you're looking at a noisy sensory signal, the type that Janneke has told us about this morning. And subject is an observer in this task. He's looking at the world and trying to make sense of it, okay? And in the other example, this slot machine bandit example, now the input to the decision process is a value signal. Did I get something rewarding or not? Okay, so it would be sometimes monetary rewards or whatever else you could think of. And something else that's very different with this perceptual decision task is that now the variables that you're using to decide are outcomes of your previous actions. So now the subject is an agent in the task, is that what he sees, what are the cues to decide, are outcomes of what he has done in the past, okay? So it's not trivial that what we've seen in the previous task would generalize to a task like this. So this is exactly why we wanted to go there already without making a lot of intermediate tasks and see whether the basic, most crucial findings of our task obtained in the perceptual domain would generalize there. So we use just a simple canonical paradigm to study this, which is just a restless two armed bandit task. So it's a task of the sort that Stefano has presented yesterday. So on each trial, subjects are faced with two alternative choices. So they see two symbols. They can pick one or the other. In this case, the subject picks the red triangle and gets 52 points, okay? And on each trial, the subject can, again, make a choice between these two symbols over hundreds of trials in a block. And the thing is that over the course, okay, and before I walk you through this, this is work that I've conducted with Charles Finling, Vasilisa Skvortsova, who's a postdoc in my team, and Stefano as well. So, and as I was saying, so over the course of the block, the values that you get when you press the red triangles are not static, they vary, and they vary with some form of structure. So as you can see now, I'm plotting you over the course of a block, which is the x-axis, the reward magnitudes associated with the two symbols that you can pick, okay? And as you can see, so the red triangle starts above 50, then goes down, etc., etc., and the blue plus also has variations, such that subjects, if they accumulate what they've seen in the past, if they use some sort of reinforcement learning model or even something more complicated, they can, at a given point in time, have different subjective values associated with the two bandits and try to guess which of the two is likely to give a higher payoff than the other, okay? And the task of the subject was simply to try to maximize their payoffs in each of these blocks. So to model this, and to use what we found in the original perceptual task, we modified the classical reinforcement learning scheme to allow for inference noise in the model. So I'm going to show you how it looks like if you just draw a simple graphical model of the reinforcement learning scheme. So I'm showing you in blue the subjective values that the subject has about the two options that he has to choose in the middle. So time is going from left to right, and on each trial, the subject makes an action. So you see from QT to AT, he chooses one of the two options. He gets a reward associated with it. That reward will drive a reward prediction error, which will update the subjective values on trials T+1 with a learning rate alpha that you see on the top left, which is a free parameter of the model. And then the subjects will start over. Something that I haven't said is that the variability in this task is usually assumed to come solely from a softmax selection rule, which you can see at the bottom, meaning that subjects will not always pick the reward that is associated with the highest expected value, but will sometimes make these, as I said, exploratory choices where he's going to pick the one that is a bit less valued, and yeah, that's it. Yeah. What we added to the model was the fact that now we assume that the learning rule that was driving the change from QT to QT+1, so the update in your value signals, would not be done deterministically, but would be computed with a certain variance on top of it. So it's exactly the same kind of noise that I've put in my original Bayesian observer, but I've just translated it into this reinforcement learning scheme. So it's additive noise that you add every time you update your value signals based on the previous outcome, okay? And typically in reinforcement learning models that you can skim through in the literature, it's assumed to be null, the parameter doesn't exist, right? So this epsilon would be something like the standard deviation of this learning noise. And if you're looking at very classical psychometric curves that you can look in this task, so I'm plotting here what a decision maker would do in this task when you look how often he would pick the A option given the difference in value signals between A and B. So the x-axis is the difference between A and B, and on the y-axis you have the probability that the decision maker is going to pick A. And so this kind of sigmoid shape, as I said, is a signature of the softmax decision rule. And what it creates is that the pink shaded portions are what you would call exploratory decisions. The fact that you would choose sometimes A even when B is slightly more valued, or vice versa, right? So if now you look at the same graph with a model that has no softmax, so he's choosing always the most valued option, but he features internal variability, you would see the exact same graph, okay? So you would see this, and it would look as if the observer, or the decision maker, is making these exploratory decisions that are predicted by a softmax decision rule, but actually he's not. So the decision maker in this rule is always picking the most valued option on the basis of his internal signals, but because our model that we use to fit these value signals doesn't account for this internal noise, we're going to mistake these trials for exploratory decisions, okay? So actually, misassigning variability in a decision model, something which many people think it's just a tedious exercise because variability, you put it somewhere, it's just like a carpet kind of parameter that draws the variance that you can't explain. It can have important consequences on the way you think about what people are doing in the task. Just to show you what are the differences between the variability that is driven by softmax selection or by inference noise in this task. So, of course, a selection that is noisy, a choice that is noisy or variable, will not alter your value signals, okay? And by contrast, inference noise predicts that every time you update your value signals, you do that with a certain random error, so that value signal will be corrupted. That's a strong difference between the two. Another feature that we put inside the model that makes it work even better is that in the softmax, in the classical softmax rule, the variability is completely unrelated to the surprise that you got on the previous trial. So how surprising the previous outcome was. And what we put in our inference noise model is that the random error that we put on the model every time you update your value signal was scaling with the magnitude of this update signal, which is the reward prediction error in this paradigm. We are assuming that when subjects have to update strongly their value signals, that they will make this with a larger error. This is what you call a Weber kind of rule in psychophysics, okay? So it's just a classical rule that has been observed in many areas of perceptual research. And the last, a very important thing, is that if you think of a softmax decision rule, the variability that makes you explore on the given trial is completely independent from the variability that will drive you to explore or not on the subsequent trial. But if your value signals are corrupted, then what drove you to select a less valued signal, an apparently less valued signal on trial T, is still going to be there on the next trial because your value signals were corrupted. So this corruption will accumulate, will propagate, and will create autocorrelations across trials. Okay, and we're going to see how we can distinguish between these different things. The first thing we did was use this modified reinforcement learning model that accounts for inference noise and test whether we needed inference noise to better fit the data. Okay, so we did that in the classical condition that I've showed you earlier, and we found, so I'm showing you on the left, a comparison between a reinforcement learning model with noise and a reinforcement learning without noise, and you can see that the likelihood of the model that features noise is much higher than the one that doesn't, with a large exceedance probability, which tells us that already the classical vanilla model that people are classically using is, I won't say wrong, but at least is put aside by this analysis. And then if we compare whether the model does feature a softmax decision rule or a pure argmax, which is the optimal decision rule, you always pick the most valued option. You see that subjects also use a softmax, okay? What we did then was to not stay there, but split the overall variability in the choices made by the subject between the two parts. The variability due to this inference noise variable and the variability due to this softmax decision rule. And already, so if you think of classical models, this whole bar will be set in purple, okay? And you can see that it's important, so the noise is not just explaining a tiny fraction of variance, it's explaining more than 2/3 of the overall variability that we observed in subjects' behavior in this particular task. Something that's quite interesting is that we didn't do only that condition, which Stefano would call the partial feedback condition. We also tested the other condition that Stefano is interested in, which is the complete feedback condition, where now subjects don't only see what they've chosen, but they also see the outcome of the unchosen option. And if you think of what would be a reason to explore in this task, it is completely useless if you see everything. Because why would you explore in such a task? It's because if you select the red triangle for a certain number of trials, you don't know now anymore where the blue plus has gone. And so you might want to pick the blue plus sometimes because you want to make sure that you're not missing a steep rise of its value, and so you would still pick a bad option, right? But in the complete feedback condition, because you've seen the two options on each trial, there is no need to explore. You get all the information about the task on each and every chart. And the interesting thing that we found when we fitted the same model in those complete outcome charts is that now the exploration term, so the softmax term, is almost gone, okay? And the best fitting model is a model that features only inference noise, but that features an argmax decision rule, meaning a rule where the subject always picks the most valued option given his internal representations. So you see, so the softmax is there when there is a need for exploration, but our model affords to say that when there is no need for exploration, it seems that subjects are not stupid and they're not even implementing a softmax decision rule. Okay? And this is just to show you that, okay, let's forget that. I can also show you something important is that you might say maybe this exercise has flaws, maybe the way I define my inference noise has properties that are not very realistic or whatever. So I'm going to try to convince you that there are other arguments that are in favor of this inference noise in this task is coming from reaction times. So they are an independent measure that I haven't used in any of the previous slides, okay? We know in this task that reaction times co-vary with the choice conflict. So when you're seeing the two symbols with the distance between the values of the two symbols, of the two options that you have to face. If they're close together, it's more difficult to pick the best one. You're going to take a longer time to decide. If they're very far apart, it's going to be much faster for you to decide. So I've computed this conflict signal, okay, which is the x-axis on this graph, based on the fits of a model that is just the vanilla reinforcement learning model without inference noise, and on the other hand, from a model which features inference noise. And if you compare how well you fit the model with these two, how well you fit reaction times with these two models, here again, the model with inference noise is fitting much better the reaction time data than the model without inference noise. So I think that's providing additional evidence of the fact that people variable in this task a lot because they are using a variable, an imprecise learning scheme, not because they're choosing randomly, right? Something also interesting is that if you make a very slight change to the task, okay, in the original task, as I've shown you, the two symbols are completely uncorrelated in value. So you can't guess how good a symbol is from the other symbol. You have to try. You have to see the two symbols to see where they are. We just made different blocks where we told the subjects, and it was true, that the two symbols were now anti-correlated in value, meaning that when one was good, the other one was likely to be bad. And we were hoping that if people know that and use that they would explore less in these blocks. And this is what you see on this graph. So you see, so that's a replication data set. So you see the uncorrelated is exactly the same as in the original experiment with 30 more subjects. We get the exact same finding. And the one below is the same subjects in these anti-correlated blocks. You see that they explore less. The purple part is reduced. So now, why is it important also to think about this source of variability in this task? Is that actually biases that people think about in this type of research can be simply manifestations of inference noise. And I'm going to show you two of them. The first one is repetition bias. So in this task, people have often found that you have to add a parameter to vanilla reinforcement learning, which is a tendency to stick to your previous decision. So you shift your softmax rule towards the previous chosen option, and you fit better the data this way. What I told you earlier is that inference noise by its own presence will drive people to select, to show this kind of repetition bias due to this autocorrelation in the decision noise across successive trials. And so what I've looked at is whether the observed repetition bias that I get from subjects' behavior could be predicted from simulations of a reinforcement learning model with only inference noise but no repetition bias, okay? And as you can see, there is a stark, so each of the dots is one subject, and as you can see, there is a strong positive correlation between the observed repetition bias and the one that is directly predicted, that is not even fitted, that is just a consequence of inference noise. This is true for the partial outcome condition, also for the complete outcome condition. The correlation is there in both. And something even more interesting that we got out of the box as well is that the colors of these dots, maybe you can see that they are more blue on the left and more white on the right. And the color of the dots correspond to the learning rate of each of the subjects. There is a prediction of inference noise that is, of course, if you have a very strong learning rate, meaning that you're going to forget quickly about the past, then the noise will not propagate very much across shards, and so the repetition bias should be smaller. But if your learning rate is low, meaning that you will accumulate over longer and longer periods of time, then the noise will also corrupt future choices because you haven't got rid of it by forgetting about it. So as you can see, we have this prediction that is validated such that subjects that have the strongest repetition bias are also the ones that have the lowest learning rate on the right of these two graphs. Okay? So we can even see weird idiosyncrasies that of course I could have interpreted as active manifestations of biases in subjects' head that are actually purely consequences of inference noise. Another bias which you find in this task is that sometimes you see that subjects make more exploratory choices following surprising outcomes. When you have something very surprising, then on the subsequent trial, you're more likely to explore. Okay? And as you can see, I'm showing you here this, so the bars are the subject's data. So I'm now computing the softmax inverse temperature for trials that follow small reward prediction errors and trials that follow large prediction errors. Okay, and you see this difference in the bars, which is exactly the effect I'm telling you. So the lower, meaning the more exploratory you are. You see, after large surprises, people are slightly more exploratory. But I can even predict this effect quantitatively and qualitatively with just the dots, which are a model that doesn't have any of this explicit computation, that is just featuring this inference noise that scales with the reward prediction errors. And you can fit this effect in the partial outcome and in the complete outcome. So I don't need these extra parameters that people have put in the model to explain various weird features of the behavior. I can explain all of them with a model with noise and with no biases. So if I compare my model with inference noise to a model that is still the vanilla reinforcement learning model with a softmax and different biases, it loses relative to my model, which is more parsimonious as well because it has less variables. Okay? And it's true in the both conditions. The last part of this talk will be to look for sources in the brain of this inference noise, because if it exists, and here we are just seeing features in the behavior of the subjects that betray its presence, but there is nothing very clear-cut. I don't observe it because by definition it's something that happens in this internal decision variable, which is inaccessible at the behavioral level. So what we've done, so we've scanned the 30 subjects that I've showed you earlier. So all the behavior was taken from subjects in the scanner. And we first identified a few sets of regions of interest that people have associated with exploratory decisions in the past. So we've done a simple model-free contrast by contrasting decisions where the subject is changing his mind, so going from the red triangle to the blue plus or vice versa, versus trials in which he's repeating the same decision. And if you do this contrast, amongst other regions, we focused on the DACC and the frontopolar cortex, which people have associated with the past with a tendency to explore, right? And the first thing we did was to compute a parametric multiple regression of the latent variables predicted by our model to see whether we could find correlations with the inference noise in these two regions. And this is what we found. So we've computed a classical correlation of the ACC with the relative chosen value, and it's negative as everyone has always seen. It's positively correlating with the choice conflict, which is something classical. But on top of these two, it also correlates positively with the amount of noise that was added on that particular trial. Okay? And if you do that in the frontopolar cortex, you get the same basic effect. That's the first step in the analysis. A second step is that behaviorally, I've tried to argue that the noise that I see is not coming from choice or from selection, from a softmax, but is coming from learning. So one way to show that using brain data is to compare these choices where, as you can see, subjects on each trial is choosing one of the symbols and observing the outcome, to cued response trials that we did in the scanner as well, where on a quarter of all choices, subjects did not have the possibility to choose. They were forced to pick the symbol that we highlighted. So here the red triangle. So in these trials, you will agree with me that there is no choice process. Subjects are not choosing, they are just cued to respond this or that. So they are not choosing based on the value signals, they are choosing based on this little darker rectangle. And what was nice is that we found that even in these Q trials, there was an exactly matched representation of inference noise, okay, that was present in the two regions, okay? So even though in those trials, of course, the relative chosen value does not correlate anymore with SEC activity or frontopolar activity because people are not choosing. So the chosen value is meaningless. You're forcing them sometimes to choose the poorly valued option. You still see a representation, a correlation with the inference noise predicted by the model on those Q trials. Something very important as well is that all these analyses were done locked to the choice. So when people are looking at the two symbols. But as I told you, if the noise is coming during learning, then it should already be there when people have observed the previous outcome. So we've put another regressor that is locked to the previous outcome, which is now the bar which is dotted. And as you could see in the ACC, we found already a representation of this inference noise exactly at the time where it's supposed to be arising in the learning process, okay? And in the ACC, it was very clear that it was almost as strong. In the frontopolar cortex already, we could see that there was a difference between locking this analysis to the previous outcome or looking at the regressors locked to the current choice. Yep, yeah, perfect. Okay, so here we have a slight difference between the two regions, but I think it's not enough for me to convince you of any sort of functional dissociation between the two regions. And the only way we could think to try to get to that was to do what people call a brain behavior correlation analysis. So I'm going to walk you through